Chapter 9. Rayford, Zion, Chaim, Mac, and Bruce were sitting at the top of the steps when Yerrick appeared below and discreetly signaled them to rise. Passing the priest from behind and taking the steps two at a time was the Lord's Prince, King David of Israel. Rayford felt awkward struggling to his feet, and he sensed the others did too. He wondered if he would find his voice as David began greeting each of the men by name, embracing and kissing them on both cheeks. Zion, the celebrated scholar whose courage sacrificed his own family. Chaim, also known as Micah, leader of the remnant, welcome. Montgomery Cleburne, also known as Mac, a loyal friend. Bruce, one of the first to wear a blood-washed robe, welcome, welcome. Rayford had seen David only from afar, but was struck again by how human and normal he seemed. After having admired the man and his exploits for so long, he wouldn't have been surprised to discover him the size of Goliath. David, too, had apparently been restored to his ideal age, appearing perhaps in his late 20s with sinewy arm and leg muscles, large hands, bronzed skin, and a trim dark beard that set off prominent features. He wore a purple robe with gold fringe, but a simple gold crown with a small silver frontispiece bearing a diamond was pushed back on his head, almost as an afterthought. Rayford Steele, David said, reaching for him, he of the changed mind and heart. Rayford, nearly overcome, took a step back from the embrace and bowed. Your Majesty. Oh, we don't concern ourselves with such formalities here, David said, unless we're dealing with some reprobate subject, which you plainly are not. We all know who the real sovereign is. Sit, please. As the men sat again, Yerrick disappeared, and David settled a few steps below them. Rayford had the feeling they should switch places, especially after having assumed they would meet somewhere below David's throne. Forgive me, sir, but it doesn't seem right to be looking down on you. Well, David said with a laugh, it's all right with me, provided your view of me is only physical. I assure you it is. I know. Your faithfulness to the Lord is well established, all of you. Rayford was amused that the others were still obeying the priest's admonition of silence. They did not acknowledge even this compliment. David spoke with an earnest passion and direct gaze. Presiding over Israel has been simple during this era, he said. The counselors, judges, and I have adjudicated minor disputes, mostly over land or possessions. The Lord has given us his wisdom so that the opponents leave happy and usually friends. This is the result when the Lord is the king. Another benefit is that most nations have had the foresight to keep children out of places of authority. Unfortunately, Egypt failed to see the wisdom in that, and she elevated two to her elder council who had not even yet reached a majority. I imagine you have heard the result. Rayford nodded. Tongues are wagging all over Israel regarding Egypt's failure to attend the Feast of Tabernacles. It should be no surprise that this has kindled the wrath of the Lord, David said. One of the reasons he decreed mandatory involvement in these observances was that these nations had reviled his chosen people in generations past. The Feast of Tabernacles allows all nations to pay homage to the Lord in his house for the annual harvest and provisions. The Lord has been faithful. Egypt has proven unfaithful. Thus says the Lord God, my eyes shall be on the faithful of the land, that they may dwell with me. He who walks in a perfect way, he shall serve me. He who works deceit shall not dwell within my house. He who tells lies shall not continue in my presence. Early I will destroy all the wicked of the land, that I may cut off all the evildoers from the city of the Lord. That, gentlemen, is why it behooves all kings to be wise and be instructed. They should serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and they perish in the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all those who put their trust in him. And it shall come to pass, that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whichever of the families of the earth do not come to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, on them there will be no rain. They shall receive the plague with which the Lord strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Sir, I summoned you and your associates today, because I need your help. I am but king of Israel, prince to Jehovah. Egypt is beyond my jurisdiction. He will deal with her as has been prophesied in his word. However, the Lord has assigned me to see to the healing of that land after the accursed are slain and the land has suffered drought. Slain? Do you marvel that the Lord keeps his word? No, but you assumed that those responsible for leading astray the rest of Egypt's leaders would not be judged until they reached their 100th years. I suppose I did. By their actions, they have cursed themselves. Still viewed as children because of their youth, they have become an affront to the Almighty, and they shall surely die. The Lord shall mete out justice, but he also seeks to heal their land. Egypt will require rebuilding and growth and development. You and your men are his choices to carry that out. With your labor shall come the responsibility and the privilege of telling the good news of his salvation to the remainder of Egypt's young unregenerate. Rayford fell prone, and his friends with him. We are at the Lord's service. May we be found worthy. And Rayford's next century of effort was fixed. We traveled from Greece for the Feast of Tabernacles, as we do every year, Yekaterina Risto told Kenny as they sat at a table 50 feet from hundreds of napping children. And now we want to stay where the Lord himself sits on the throne, although we will miss our homeland. Tell me of your life there. My parents met in an underground church that was once ministered to by your grandfather and your parents, as I understand it. The congregation feared for their lives every day, hiding from global community peacekeeping forces. My mother was pregnant with me when Jesus returned at the glorious appearing. So like me, you are in your 90s. A child, she said, smiling. Of course, this is all I have known, but I have seen pictures of my mother when she looked much as I do now. She tells me she had just turned 16. Kenny nodded. This time is as the days of Noah, when people lived for centuries. I only wish I could stop aging at a youthful year, as your mother and grandmother have. I didn't know my grandmother before the glorious appearing, Kenny said, but pictures of her from before the rapture show her older than she looks now. Kenny found Yekaterina easy to talk to, and he felt more comfortable with her than he had almost anyone else he had ever encountered. How did you become a believer? She said. He smiled. That's what I'm supposed to be asking you. Oh, my story is not so dramatic. You first. Mine is less, he said. For as long as I can remember, our house has been filled with stories of the rapture, the tribulation, the glorious appearing, the millennial kingdom. I grew up in it, and I was the first child in cot. Indeed? They tell me I am the reason for this ministry, that because my mother was martyred first and my father was killed on the last day of the tribulation, God promised to repay them 100-fold for losing me. Only they didn't really lose me. My grandfather took care of me until they returned from heaven. Regardless, God keeps his promises, and look at what their 100-fold has become. And it was my mother who led me to Christ, just as is true of my uncle, who also works here. Raymie Steele? His mother is Irene? Exactly. She shook her head. What a heritage! As I said, my story is not so colorful. Sad to say, however, I was 80 before I became a believer. Really? You were actually an unbeliever that long with the background you had? She nodded. It might be more precise to say I was undecided. I could not doubt that Jesus was the Lord and the Son of God and God. I just didn't know what I wanted to do about it. Surely your parents raised you to understand the faith. And my need, yes. I felt terrible about my indecision. But there was a stubborn, selfish, prideful side of me that would not give in. Did you fake it, or did your parents know? They knew. I never hid my feelings. I had a huge problem with my free will. I didn't want to not have a choice, and so I vowed I would choose on my own in my own timing. Did you know you had only until you turned 100? Of course. That was my parents' biggest fear, that I would remain resolute too long. What changed your mind? Friends. A few felt the same way I did, or at least I thought they did. They took their resolve further than I did. I was sincere in wanting to decide for myself, to not just inherit my parents' faith. I wasn't a scoffer. I didn't criticize or turn against Jesus. I just wanted my own way, to live for myself. And I thought I understood the consequences. How this terrified my parents. They tried everything, reminding me that it had been their hard hearts that had caused them to miss the rapture and have to endure the tribulation. It was only by the grace of God that they survived till the glorious appearing. But your friends, they were hostile. They didn't study or investigate or even think about it after a while. They made fun of the devout, and they refused to acknowledge Jesus at all. Have you heard of the other light? Oh, yes. Some of them moved to other parts of Europe so they could join that. They not only chose against Christ, but they also chose for Lucifer. It was as if he became their hero, like a martyr who wasn't dead, but only temporarily bound. But don't they know his destiny? Yekaterina stood and paced. That's just it, Mr. Williams. Kenny. Oh, I don't know about that. If I'm going to work for you, not that I'm saying I know I'll get the job. It's all right. Call me what you wish. I'll tell you what, if you call me Cat, I'll call you whatever you wish. You're on, Cat. Anyway, that's just it. They have delusions of grandeur. They actually believe they can become so organized and widespread and strong that they can change the course of history, even if they die hundreds of years before the final conflict. Imagine that, she said. But again, this is where they've become so idealistic. They want to be martyrs to their cause. They find that glamorous. One told me she believed that if they did their jobs and passed down through the generations their doctrines and their war plans, Satan would actually win and have the power to resurrect them so they could rule with him. Kenny stood and leaned against the table. That's a new one for me. I suppose they'd have to sincerely believe that to continue in their lunacy. Yekaterina nodded. Eventually, that's what changed my mind. I found that the more of my friends who found the other light attractive, the more repulsed I was by it. My hesitation over Jesus was all about me, myself, my pride, my ego. I didn't want to give up the reins of my life. For my friends, it was that they had actually become the Lord's enemy. They read the same scriptures I did, heard the same stories, and came to opposite conclusions. They came to believe that Lucifer got a raw deal, that he hadn't really done anything bad enough to be treated the way God treated him. They actually started praying to him. None of them ever claimed to hear from him, but the very idea terrified me. To be casting your lot with and praying to the enemy of God, locked away somewhere in the bowels of the earth for 1,000 years, like you say, it's lunacy. So that changed your mind? Well, sort of. That's the best part.